Welcome to another episode of Neil Wolf News. I'm your host, Neil Wolf. In this episode, I'm happy to have a guest in studio who is a good friend of mine. His name is Ronn Perea. He's a historian and author, and we're going to have a chat today because it's March, and March is International Women's Month. And we're going to have a chat about one of his novels entitled Elsie and Elsa. This is a historical fiction novel about two girls who grew up in Albuquerque and remained friends even while they were separated, while Elsa moved back to Italy and Elsie remained in Albuquerque, and then they were reunited later in life. And this novel, Elsie and Elsa, is about all of the little known history that occurred all around them that had international impact. So let's get right into this. So I recently found out that March is International Women's Month, which made me think of a novel that I recently read that was focused on two girls that grew up here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. One was a local gal and one was a migrant from Italy. Is that correct, Ron?
No, not from Italy, from Italia. Yes, but you're correct, Bob. That's how they meet, really, in high school. Mama and Papa invite Elsie to go work with them. They needed the help in the bakery. And that's where they really gelled. And that's where they discovered that there was a newly installed Italian prisoner of war camp. And Papa got a contract to go service the Italian POWs. So there they go, making deliveries to the Italian POWs. And they were scared to death initially. But soon, when they entered, they kind of appreciated the admiration of all the POWs who had not seen any women in a long time. And then all they see is these two bellissima young women come in, and next thing you know, when they leave, they're very appreciative that they even were there. And so future deliveries, I promise you, was no problem. And then along the way, we find out that the high school girls at Albuquerque High soon were skipping class here and there just to go see the cute Italians. And it evolved from there. Papa had a serious accident in the kitchen. So they picked up on the ability to bring in help from the POW camp. So some manpower was added, helping Papa work around the kitchen. And that's when they were in close quarters, when Elsa could communicate with a young Capitan who had been educated in Oxford, in England, strong command of the English language. And they were doing very well until one day Elsa did something she was not supposed to. She slipped into this Italian officer's pocket an item of contraband that they were not allowed to have. It was a copy of the daily newspaper. Things weren't going good for Italy, so they were trying to keep the Italians pacified. So the newspaper was taboo, but they brought in the wrong copy on that day. It showed Mussolini dangling upside down. This caused the Italians, POWs, to riot. It was the first riot of all the riots Albuquerque would have in its history, the very first riot. And it caused disorder, I promise you. The country club set, who had the primary residences that surrounded the POW camps, were up in arms. They wanted the army to move them out. But the army had put 10-foot fences all the way around and a 30-foot guard tower, so they weren't about to move it out. And but pressure and pressure and pressure. Finally, they decided to move the Italians back south to Roswell, where they could contain them there. But to make room down there, Did you know that that's where they got the Nazi POW camps to replace them?
Huh.
And so the Italians turned into Nazis. What else can I answer for you?
So I noticed when I was reading the book that it's all real history that took place and revolved around Elsie and Elsa, and that even
It was just simply because it was the glue to keep all these unrelated historical events together.
very good. I think you did a very good job in doing that, and I like the
Can you
fact,
see how my ego is growing? Thank you.
and I like that it ties in with this month and this being International Women's Month. That they had these experiences all around them, and that you even named the people. These names are actual relations to you. So these stories came straight
I was
from...
fortunate to have been introduced to these historical events all my life. Finally, write about it. And so, there comes Elsie and Elsa.
And so to let the viewers know that Elsie is actually your mother, and her friend, the Italian, is Elsa, and we'll even get a little bit later in this episode to your grandmother who makes an appearance, Rose.
Yes.
And so Elsie and Elsa, they had these experiences in high school. Elsa met her love there at the Italian POW camp and the one that came to work at the bakery. But then they went off to Los Angeles where Elsie...
They were both the same guy. The guy that they met at the POW camp and who would come to the work at the bakery.
Right. And Elsie fell in love with him.
And then Elsa thought that was going to be the last she would ever see of him because they shipped off the Italians to Roswell, and then soon came the Nazis. But they graduated from high school, so they needed to work.
Right.
So they went where they got the jobs, in L.A.
So what did they do out there?
They got a job with the Hughes aircraft factory and started putting together all of the airplanes. Now this was a bigger job than even the men were used to because the men weren't around. And so uniquely the jobs went to the women.
And something happened with Elsie, right? She started to engage with her future husband?
Okay, so as the war went on and certain men were getting letters from women from home as a moral support, a USO undertaking to give men some notices from home. And as a duty, Elsie, my mom, thought she would write a letter to some stranger, not figuring she'd ever see the stranger ever again. And so just to give moral support, wrote letters. And they were going to some stranger somewhere she never even heard of. But she did it, and when the war was over, she figured, hey, I'll never see the guy again, but I did my duty.
Very nice. But then it did work out. Let's get into the stories of both Elsie and Elsa and how they met their husbands, and then we'll get into some of the war experiences.
Okay, the war is over, right? And so the families are now getting together for the first time in years to celebrate the holidays. Now, the Elsa and her mama and papa lived in their little studio townhome upstairs above the bakery. They hosted a holiday gathering for both families to come and enjoy. The first time they were all getting together, Elsie's brother, home from the war, soon to be suffering PTSD from his undertaking, and all the gals, all the mamas and the papas, and then all of a sudden, as they were about to sit down for dinner, they hear the front doorbell of the bakery downstairs. Papa has to go down. Tell them, hey, sorry, we're closed. But to the surprise of the family, he comes walking up with a special guest. Who is it? Guess who?
Tell me.
As if he didn't read the book. The Italian officer has come back. A fellow Elsa has not seen in more than a year. Thought she had seen the last of him. But he comes back Dapper Dan, looking good. Mom and Papa are well off. They own a vineyard in Italia, Florence, Italy. And so he's brought with him a case of their selections of wine. That party that night turned out very nice, I promise you. But this actually happened. And so that's where the romance really starts, with the thumbs up from Mama and Papa for Elsie and her Italian POW.
And so that is what took Elsa back to Italy.
So they decided to go home, and the Italian POW, came to pick up Elsa and take her home. And that's where they would start and raise their family.
And then this was in the meantime when Elsie, your mother, met your father?
Not just yet. So there's Elsie. She didn't want to work in the bakery no more. So she started getting other jobs. Makeup counter at Penny's. You remember that store, ladies and gentlemen? But it was downtown Albuquerque. And she was doing it. Come summertime, she was hanging out at the main hangout in Albuquerque. It was called Tingley Beach. You can't tell by now, but speedboats up and down, people diving deep into the pond, and that's how people would spend their summertime. The number one attraction in that town was Tingley Beach. So as a youth, she's still young, still had a nice figure. She would lay out on the beach, read, and so she read and read and read. So she was about time. She had to go to work. This was the summertime, And as she made her exit on the billboard, there was a bulletin says, "Dance tonight. USO, dance tonight. Women welcome." Been a long time since she's been a dancing, and she was always a dancing fool, So heck, she had to be there. So after work, ran home, got dressed, spruced up, her special red lipstick, and she went to that dance dressed to kill. First time she had been having the ability to dress to kill. And there she was. She danced with every soldier that was there. But there was one particular guy that she would be watching throughout the evening. But yet, he still had not asked her to dance. And she was dancing with all the other fellows. And so, finally, the big old orchestra announced that this was their last dance of the evening, because tomorrow they were themselves going to break away from their military uniforms and retire the band. And as such, this is our last dance of the evening. That fellow cut through the crowd directly to Elsie. And without saying a word, they both embraced and took that last dance of the evening. And they seem to recall what that was on the road to Santa Fe, a Glenn Miller tune. And they, without saying a word, they just looked at each other and started dancing. As he wanted to walk her home, and she decided, well, okay. Along that way, they discovered, guess what? He was just back home to find out that before he goes home to his ranch, his family's ranch, to recover tomorrow, he wanted to come to the dance tonight to find out that he was the guy that she was writing to.
Awesome. So that's how your parents met.
And that's how they met. I like it was destined.
Beautiful. And so, coming back from war, he had quite a difficult experience during World War II. Would you like to share about that?
My pop was a Bataan Death March survivor. That was followed up by 3 years as a POW. And the horrors of war that he understood is what I convey in the novel that was told to me from him a few years before he passed on. And I'm glad he did, because otherwise it would not have provided me the record that he did. And all my life, I got to tell you this, I asked Dad, "Hey Dad, what did you do during the war?" Well, actually I would say in reality, "Hey Dad, what'd you do during the war?" And he said, "Shut up, kid, I'll let you know someday." He finally did. And I got to tell you, I was a grown guy, but it was still hard not to cry.
Yeah.
You asked, I told you.
Well, thank you for sharing that difficult experience with us. And these things, I mean, they're things that we've gone through in history, and we can't forget about the past. I mean, that's a big problem I have with the world today, is that they're just trying to erase history. And I think it's important to remember, and I'm glad that you're doing the job about preserving it in books like this.
I cannot stand anyone who wants to ignore what came before us. It's apprehensible.
And so you mentioned earlier that it was Elsie's brother, I believe, that was your uncle, that also had a pretty difficult experience during also World War II?
Yes, he was before the war, he was a rambunctious fellow. Then the war hit, and he could not, everybody flocked to join up in long lines at the recruitment centers, except my uncle was getting rejected left and right, 4-H. And finally he was able to get into the Navy. And so he went off to war. And it was a couple years later when my grandma Rose received a letter from the Navy Department that her son was missing in action. And of course, that destroyed her, not knowing any further news on the health of her son. And she had to experience it by herself, because her daughters were off in LA working in airplane factories. And how she got through that alone, I'll never know. She did have emotional help, so I tell about that in the book, of course. And that's how that went down. But to find out when he finally came home what had happened to him. He was actually blown off a ship in the South Pacific in what would become known as the largest naval battle in humankind history.
Wow.
Called the Battle of Leyte Gulf. More battleships facing off than have ever done in recorded history. And it happened. What can you say?
And from what I recall, there was one more pretty serious tie back to a war event, and I think that was with one of Elsie's sons, who was a brother to you.
So now you want to jump 20 years ahead?
Yeah.
Okay. He's the boss. Yeah, eventually, Mom would have 3 of us kids. I was the youngest until my other brother came along. But my older brother would get killed in Vietnam. The news of that and how that impacted the typical image. The family comes home from church one Sunday morning. There waiting was a military army vehicle, and 2 soldiers exit and approaches us up the front sidewalk. Now, I was a novice little kid. I thought it was great that I've seen some soldiers. But before they even got close enough to introduce themselves, Mom was collapsing on the ground. Now, that hurt to see, because I couldn't understand why. She knew She knew. She had that plenty of experience. And because that was her only son.
Hmm.
My dad knew, but he had to be the strong one, and he had to help my mom. So that's the day that they found out that my brother had been killed.
Yeah, that's a really hard story.
1969, in a battle that would be later known as Hamburger Hill.
I've definitely heard of the battle. And so let's wrap up with the Elsie and Elsa portion of this. Let's talk about them and getting back together. So they spent years apart.
Okay, so now they're living in Florence, Italy. Elsa and her husband. They have a couple of kids. The Vinery, the winery, doing extremely well. And being bugged in his ear all their life by Elsa, she wanted to come back to Albuquerque and open up a winery. And so finally, her husband was able to talk the family into underwriting a winery here. So in early '62, they come to town. Maybe it was late '61. They come back with a couple of kids in tow who didn't speak a word of English. And they felt, yeah, it's about time that the kids learned English. And so they returned. And the two gal pals reunited for the first time in 15 years.
Great. Beautiful.
And so they started kicking off and doing pretty well for themselves. And this is why Elsie and Elsa only start to contribute for the rest of their life. That's only halfway through the book. Stories of other historical events that would occur around them that they couldn't even realize.
So actually, I'd like to take a pivot right now, and I'd like to put the focus on Rose, who was your grandmother. And I was wondering if you could tell us, she had one of her first jobs was at a pretty famous hotel downtown, wasn't it?
The Hilton Hotel.
The Hilton.
She was assistant chef. And along the way, as assistant chef, it was part of her job to personally provide any personal care to any of the people that were high-fluting guests of the hotel. Some were very notable types. Some were celebrities. And she would be the one designated to give them their personal treats and how to serve them on their room service meals, etc., etc. So along the way, she met her share of celebrities and highfalutin types. And she would do that for about 25 years there.
And there was a time, was that June 1945, that an infamous duo had come through on their way to High Street for some reason?
Okay, now, June 3rd, 1945. There was a special, well, you can't call him special, although he was a low rent in my opinion, guest in room 505 who had arrived the night before from the Russian embassy in Montreal. Came on the Santa Fe Chief. And she serves him because he was, when it came time to tipping, he was very, very cheap. She was used to more grateful remunerations. He didn't give nothing. Well, can I be more descriptive?
Sure.
Where these guests would be slipping green paper to them. This guest provided a tip of pulling out of his wallet a penny, a nickel, another penny. So, needless to say, she remembered this fellow. For years later, when she was talked to by the FBI. Do you recognize this guy? And as the story would go on, it was this guy who would proceed out of the hotel on that June 3rd. Everybody seemed to remember it was 103 degrees that day. As he proceeded east up Route 66, took a left on High Street, block and a half, to apartment 229 High Street, apartment number 4. A 45-minute meeting occurred. Bottom line is, this fellow leaves with the Fat Man design drafts and list of nuclear scientists. So I detail in account all the day the Russians stole the atomic bomb secrets.
And then Rose, her next job was at another pretty high-profile hotel. That's no longer here.
How many of these hotels are no longer here? Have you wondered that?
Right, we're going to talk about another one, I think, here coming up.
The Alvarado Hotel.
Yeah, that one.
One of the most famous sad luck stories around. But it was built in 1901. Rose started working with him in 1922. Why? She got hired because she was a beautiful woman. And that was their primary qualifier, is they wanted to hire beautiful young women as the Harvey girls. So as a Harvey girl, she got trained in the finesses of serving from the right, picking up from the left. Serving with silk napkins on top of silk tablecloths, with silver platters, with silverware, and that's how they got trained. Then one day, surprise guests. There was a Hollywood junket from old Hollywood land. And you know that Hollywood sign used to say Hollywood land until an earthquake knocked part of that down, and where it's Hollywood today. But Hollywood land era silent movie stars. So the top silent movie stars of the era got stuck at the old Alvarado Hotel. Well, the Alvarado Hotel was very happy to host them, and so were the Harvey girls. And I tell the fable how these Harvey girls would weave in and around these hotshot Hollywood types. Every single one of them, people would remember today. But one of them, one of the most famous of them all, was a fellow who wore a bowler, little mustache, cane, and it was, you know who I'm talking about?
Charlie Chaplin?
Himself. And then also the infamous, he was the very first screen lover. He's the one that started it for everybody that came after him. Rudy Valentino. And so they all came to town, and the shenanigans that went on between the Harvey girls and these movie stars. A story I have to include in the book, buddy.
And it even included Rose witnessed the demolition of the Alvarado Hotel. And this was during a transition where she moved on to yet another famous bygone hotel from Albuquerque. What was the name of that one?
Well, it was 50 years later when Rose, tears, as she sat across the street watching bulldozer demolition of the Alvarado Hotel. The memories of the decades that she worked there. And then, but she had already gone on to another hotel, 2 famous since then. She now was at the Best Western Hotel, assistant chef, there doing what she'd always done for decades, serving the creme de la creme of guests. And you know which one? Movie stars. But should I tell them about the...
I think you should tell.
President JFK. And serving them and a couple of his Hollywood friends. I'd tell you about them, but you got to read the book.
Thank you, Ron. This has been a nice talk. This is what I recall from the women perspective from your novel. How would you like to wrap this up for us today?
This book was written for women for women because Elsie and Elsa tells it from the female point of view, locking up the historical events that actually happened that people don't even know or were even aware of. Ideal for the women. After all, I'm a man who likes women.
I know that about you, Ron. Thank you for spending this time with me today.
Now, I want everybody to witness that I want to shake this guy's hand. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. So thank you to my friend Ronn Perea for stopping into the studio and having this historical chat with us to celebrate International Women's Month. And if you want to order your copy of Elsie and Elsa, you can get it on Ronn's website, which is ronperea.com, and that's Ron with 2 N's, perea.com. And if you use coupon code NEOWOLF during checkout, you can get 10% off. So go to ronperea.com to order your copies. And if you like content like this, follow us on social media at NeoWolf News. And I'm on Brighteon, BitChute, Rumble, and YouTube, as well as Gab, Twitter, Facebook, and Parler, now that Parler's back. Thanks for tuning into this episode, and we'll see you again soon.